Good afternoon. Today is still Tuesday, March 19. We are convening our afternoon meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners, our regular meeting. And we set up this time certain for the convenience of Sheriff Trapp and Susan Sowards. So at this time, I'm going to read the title for item 14A, Order 0903-19-06 in the matter of revising the 2017-2019 Community Corrections Grant in Aid and Justice Reinvestment Grant Program, JPGP budgets, and delegating authority to the Public Safety Coordinating Council Criminal Justice Planner to sign and submit JRGP revision forms online and to complete and submit the Community Corrections Biennial Plan Modification Form and to the County Administrator to amend intergovernmental agreements and contracts. With us to discuss this is Sheriff Byron Trapp, Lane County Sheriff, and also in his role as Vice Chair of the Public Safety Coordinating Council, as well as Susan Sowards, the Principal Criminal Justice Planner for the Public Safety Coordinating Council. Welcome to both of you.
Chair Sorensen and members of the board, thank you. I think the presentation might take us a little less time than the introduction. And we'll leave it that way on purpose, give you, if you have questions, otherwise it's pretty straightforward, I believe. So the Lane County Public Safety Coordinating Council Budget Committee met on February 8th and reviewed the last 6 months, July through December's expenditures of the PSCC budget of grant and aid and JRGP funds. And in that analysis, which they do throughout the biennium of each of the budgeted years, is to look at the budgeted amounts in each line and to ensure that they are being spent, and if lines are underspent, identify lines that are overspending or have a need and transfer those funds. And so if in the packet, if you look, probably the easiest reference to this is on page 3, a couple of tables there, but it's a summary of what you'll find on the last 2 pages in the color budget documents, which have obviously more detail and more of a budget format. And so the line items there are the top box, funds that are not being expended or not anticipated to need the full amount that had been budgeted, and then programs in the bottom box below that are overspending or needing additional revenues to meet their needs. And so the funds above have been reallocated to the programs below. And you can see those by on the left column, the description of the funds. A couple of them are kind of exciting on the money we're adding to offender reentry program treatment through emergence. So there's additional services being provided there where we're having a higher volume of people transitioning through, and then transitional housing where we're able to provide a service level higher than we had anticipated. And in some of the other categories there, the pro and probation piece is just a result of higher wages from labor negotiations and the cost impacts that you see there that cost a little bit more of our revenues. Otherwise, I'll leave it for questions, and if I missed anything, I'll certainly invite Susan to jump in.
Okay. Any questions or comments from commissioners? Motion from commissioners.
So moved. Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Commissioner Burney, seconded by Commissioner Bozovich to approve Order 09-03-19-06 as presented. Further comments, questions from commissioners? Anything further from either of you? Nope. Okay. We will then go to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. The order is adopted by a vote of 5-0. All commissioners present and voting. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I like the ratio of the, of the reading of the proposed order and the meeting. That was good. Good ratio. Okay, item 15A, if I could get Ms. Eichner and colleagues to come forward, that'd be great. This is item 15A. This is our work session on discussion of siting standards and floodplain regulations in Lane County, Chapter 16. And if you could introduce yourselves for the board and the viewing public, that would be great.
Thank you, Chair Sorensen, and good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Keir Miller. I'm the Interim Planning Director and Division Manager in Land Management Division. With me today is Lindsay Eichner, Senior Planner in the Land Management Division. And just 1 second to get my slides going, please. So, thanks. I wish our items could be as simple as the last one that just happened. It's never quite that way.
This ratio will be turned around.
Yeah, exactly. We're here today to discuss with the board and have a work session on the potential use of land use regulations to help mitigate wildfire and flooding risks within the county. As the board will recall, the concept for this discussion came out of the land management's updates to Lane Code Chapter 16. Within those public hearing process, there was discussion regarding the fire safety standards within the forest zones. And out of that discussion was identified this need to come back to the board and talk specifically about fire safety regulations in the county. Commissioner Sorensen also requested that we discuss flooding issues as well. And this is a very broad topic. We could talk about it for a long time. I'm going to try to really streamline it and discuss these two concepts with the board and hopefully lay out some potential steps moving forward. I want to start off, though, first with a little bit of just talking about the pros and cons of using land use regulations to deal with natural hazards. Land use regulations are a tool. They're not the only tool in our toolbox. There's a number of different mechanisms that can be used to help address these concerns. There's things such as education and outreach programs are very effective at dealing with wildfire and floodplain regulations. Incentive programs, such as our Community Wildfire Protection Program, where we incentivize landowners instead of regulating them to try to take the necessary actions to help protect their homes and investments. There are insurance incentives that can be had when individuals take actions on that can help lower flood insurance, for example. So there's a number of different tools in the toolbox to help deal with these issues. Land use regulations are one of them, and since, obviously we're land use planners, this is the main tool in our toolbox, but it's like that old adage, if the hammer's your only tool, everything's a nail, and we want the board to be aware that there's a number of different available tools out there. So with that, there's obviously some benefits to addressing these concerns through sort of a comprehensive land use program. And the first one, obviously, is that it can help reduce, impacts to infrastructure, property, and of course can help save lives. The other is an increase in community resiliency, which is basically the community's ability to quickly recover and get back on its feet after a natural disaster. Land use regulations, if properly implemented, can help boost community resiliency. As the board heard last week in the discussion regarding the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, there's a really high return on investment for planning efforts. The ounce of prevention is a pound of cure sort of anecdote. Then it can complement and work in unison with some of those other non-regulatory approaches that I was discussing. And again, it can have other benefits to the community, such as savings in insurance premiums. There are, however, significant drawbacks to using land use regulations. The first one is that depending on the nature of those regulations, they can be seen by many as a real impact to private property rights. They can potentially impact property values. They can cause litigation, takings claims, for example, Measure 49 claims. And one thing that we're acutely aware of in the Land Management Division is they can be very difficult to enforce at times. They can be costly to develop. So pros and cons, just want to start off the discussion with that. So the board asked us to look at fire safety siting standards and then floodplain. I'll take the fire, kind of a high-level review of the wildfire safety. We currently have wildfire safety regulations within our forest zones, our park zones. We do not have regulations in our other zones. So there's a couple of different options that could be pursued. The first one is what is known as the development of a wildland-urban interface overlay zone. This is kind of like a floodplain zone, but it deals with wildfire risk specifically. Generally, there's a set of regulations that are developed, and they're based on the fire risks at a given property. Different standards can apply, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the second option is to, of course, potentially modify our existing fire safety standards or expand those into other zoning districts. So with the wildland urban interface zone, this is a tool. It's an overlay zone, like I mentioned, like our other beaches and dunes combining zone or airport safety overlay zone. It's one more layer of regulations that can be placed on properties that are at risk, and it can be tailored to try to identify certain specific needs at different locations. It can involve things like building code requirements, that structures be built with fire-resistant materials. It can define setbacks. It can provide specific standards for access, ability to first responders to get to those properties. So there's a number of different tools. The big advantage of a wildland urban interface zone is that it can be applied where needed, whereas currently we have these fire safety standards in our forest zones. Of course, 80% plus of the county is forested. Our regulations don't apply county-wide, those safety standards, and wildfire, as we've talked about, goes where it goes. It doesn't matter what the property zone, so it can be a comprehensive approach. Obviously can help protect lives and infrastructure, and there's been a lot of interesting developments around wildland urban interface zone regulations that really is based on sound science. So Lane County, just for a little bit of history, we went through a process to develop and propose a wildland urban interface zone back in 2006. It got as far as the Planning Commission level, and then it was tabled. It was not received well, and one of the biggest concerns was that, what's the science behind this? There's been a lot of good science in the last decade plus that really shows, why certain standards are needed and the benefits of those standards. Again, there are downsides to it. Obviously, it can bring additional costs to development, especially if you are wanting to change building practices, building with fire-resistant materials. That can be like large frame timbers or concrete slab, concrete construction. Those can add a lot of cost to development. Fire-resistant roofs, metal roofs, all those things are expensive. They only apply generally to new development, so it's not retroactive. So as we move forward, we put additions on homes or we build new dwellings, those regulations kick in. And they can be controversial, as I mentioned. And again, the enforcement, it can be difficult and it takes a lot of staff capacity. So that's one option, is the development of sort of a comprehensive countywide overlay zone. This image here is just an example. So these parcels, kind of up in the upper right corner here, not way up at the top, but the ones that sort of have a little fuel break clearing around the dwelling. So those are within our current forest zones, and they were required to develop those fuel breaks around the homes. I mean, in my mind, those fuel breaks look probably a little inadequate. Typically, the fuel breaks should be a minimum of 30 feet in all directions. Then there's a secondary fuel break of 100 feet that provides for some thinning. What we see with the fuel break standards is they're conditioned to be in place in perpetuity, but of course, over time, vegetation grows in and people kind of don't always maintain them. So just want to point out that even within our forest zone where we have these existing standards, they're not always effective, and they can be problematic to enforce. So the next option I want to discuss is modifying those existing standards. There's a number of things that we could do to build upon the standards that are within the forest and park zones. One idea would be to take those codes and apply them in other districts, just verbatim, as they are now. Another option would be to modify those existing standards to make them potentially more stringent, to address different things. We could look at increasing those fuel breaks depending on wildfire risk. The current zone regulations, they don't take in the actual wildfire risk. It's one blanket standard, regardless if the forest zone property is flat and in a vacant pasture, or if it's on steep slopes and in thick, flashy fuel and brush. So that could be, we could develop some sort of standards that are specific to the site. Another big issue that kind of came up during our discussion for Chapter 16 was this issue of pre-clearing a site, which enables developers to work around the existing regulations, because there's a balancing act, which is sort of discussed in your memo, that talks about how a dwelling should be sited, and you have to balance different factors. It should, minimize impacts to the forest zone. It should reduce wildfire. It should be clustered near a road and near other houses, so there's a balancing of factors. And when can go in ahead of submitting an application and clear an area of vegetation, that may be good because the area is now cleared of vegetation, but it may not meet other standards and things that we're interested in, like having the development closer to the road so fire safety vehicles can get to it. So that's one potential option that's available, and we could investigate different options regarding the existing standards. And here's just a little graphic to talk again about that that issue that I was just describing. So the Oregon Department of Forestry has developed some guidelines and standards which inform the administrative rules that the county administers around fire safety standards. These were developed in 1991. This is a graphic out of that packet, which is in the board's packet. And you can see from this graphic, there's this concept of where the preferred location is for a proposed dwelling. We've got this hillside here, a road, a number of existing structures already placed. There's some different ownership and some steep slopes. In the Department of Forestry's mind, the preferred location for the dwelling would be down closest to the road on the flat land, clustered with other development, out of the commercial timberland, out of the thickest forested areas. So there's a number of different factors that are there for both wildfire safety, for the homeowners as well as the first responders, and then for mitigating impacts to what is a very important industry in the county, which is the forest resources industry. This is an example of just one property in the county that you can see over on the left-hand side. I apologize, I don't have a pointer, but if you see the long parcel that runs down the middle of the left-hand picture, there's a development which is up towards the back, the rear half of that, or at the very rear of the property. There's a development there. You can see there's sort of a long winding road that takes it down to the road there, where there are other dwellings sort of clustered. There's a long drive. This is the sort of development pattern that we're trying to move away from. You can see from the picture on the right, it is up on a slope, and obviously those sites are desirable for obvious reasons. They provide great views, they provide the most privacy, so owners have a real interest in developing those sites. We can certainly understand that. There is a trade-off there, though, and that there is increased risk and potential risk to first responders as well as the homeowners. That's just another example of sort of this parcel that's this development site that's cut in. It's almost 2,000 feet from the road where there's other cluster development. So this is something we see in the county. I won't belabor that. So those are the two main options that we see that the board has before them: a comprehensive overlay zone for wildland-urban interface risks, or sort of a surgical update to existing codes. Of course, there's always the null option that the board chooses not to direct staff to do anything. So next, I want to talk quickly about floodplain regulations. We already have a fairly comprehensive set of floodplain regulations in the county. We're required to do that through the National Flood Insurance Program. These standards address things such as elevating structures so that the lowest floor is outside of the base flood elevation. The standards require certain engineering studies when development is proposed within the floodway. There's anchoring, there's different development and building standards to help mitigate losses within the floodplain. The kind of the big picture when thinking about flood risks is this is our #1 risk in the county. Flooding is much more prevalent than wildfire. It has much higher likelihood of causing damages. We have a long history of flooding in the county, and Lane County is especially susceptible. We have more river miles of floodplain than any other county in the state. We have, last count, over 10,000 parcels partially or wholly within the floodplain. We have a high number of insurance policies within the floodplain. So floodplain, improvements of floodplain regulations are obviously could be beneficial. I will say that our existing regulations right now in many ways already exceed the minimum standards for the National Flood Insurance Program. We go above and beyond some of the minimum requirements, but there are a number of other actions we could take to improve those standards. Finally, the update of our floodplain regulations, because they're driven a lot by federal standards, we do have periodic updates to those, and as part of the code modernization project that we're involved in, we are planning on doing some updates to the floodplain code. So this is already something that's on our work plan. It's just a matter of getting direction from the board on which standards could or should be revised. This graphic's pretty old, 2007, I think. But it does show sort of a breakdown, and you can see that depending on the FEMA region, flooding is a very significant risk across the country, and especially in the Northwest. It accounts for over 50% of all presidential disaster declarations. So when looking at potential updates to our floodplain zones, there's a number of actions we could take. The first one, kind of starting at probably the most potentially impactful and probably the most controversial as well, would be to regulate development in what's known as the floodway. Some jurisdictions do this. The floodway, and I have a graphic to explain this, it's different than the floodplain. It's part of the floodplain, but it is, let's see, here's a graphic. It's first and foremost, it's a theoretical construct. It's primarily the main conveyance channel where water travels in the event of a flood, but it is a model that FEMA uses that basically says if you keep this area of the channel free of encroachments, we can assume, based on engineering analysis, that the flood level won't rise more than 1 foot because you've got the, in the event of a flood, because you've basically maintained this channel and you keep all development out of it. Therefore, the flood capacity can move through and it won't increase the flooding more than 1 foot in the entire floodplain. So it's an important area to keep clear of development. We do allow certain development in the floodway when an engineer can provide an analysis called a no-rise analysis that shows that, if this one development was allowed in the floodplain, there's still enough capacity within this stretch of river to enable the development. Some communities have chosen to just say, the floodplain or the floodway is too important. It carries a higher risk. There's higher velocities generally. We're not going to regulate development, or we're not going to enable development in the floodplain at all.
Floodway.
I'm sorry, floodplain, thank you.
Floodway.
Floodway, yeah. So that's one option. There's significant floodway in Lane County. We have a lot of floodway. So this would if the county were to take this action, there would be parcels that would be rendered undevelopable because they're entirely within the floodway, excuse me. Another graphic of the floodway and the floodplain for you. The next option would be to increase what's called freeboard, and that's the standard that the lowest finished floor needs to be built above the base flood elevation. So you can see in these two graphics, the home site on the left, obviously we have living quarters below the base flood elevation. So this is a non-compliant dwelling, and this would have a high flood insurance cost, obviously, whereas the development on the right, it's up on piers. It's a pretty extreme example. Typically, the base flood elevation is met by just building off of a 2-foot stem wall or something like that, or maybe placed on fill. But as you can see, you could increase freeboard. That's another requirement. We currently have a 2-foot requirement for the base flood, for the lowest finished floor of a structure to be above that base flood elevation. The county could increase that to 3 feet. Wouldn't preclude development from being in the floodplain. It would just require that the lowest finished floor be higher. So in the event of a flood, there's additional protection and security. It would also help reduce flood risks for a property. Moving down the list, there's other things that could be done, such as prohibiting critical facilities in the floodplain, things like hospitals, police stations, roads crew stations, things like that that are needed in the event of an emergency. Currently, we do enable those to be constructed in a floodplain. Those could be regulated.
Floodway?
Both. They're allowed in a floodplain and floodway, yeah. And there are other options. Fill is a big thing. Our code currently doesn't regulate fill, but when fill material is brought into the floodplain, it can obviously impede that capacity of the floodplain to carry floodwaters out of it. So there could be requirements for every cubic yard of fill that's brought and placed within the floodplain, an equal amount is scoured out somewhere else in that stream reach to let the capacity stay as it was. So there's a number of different options that the board could take that I've just laid out a few right there for you. We could, like I said, this could be a pretty comprehensive discussion, but I just wanted to start the discussion. In terms of moving forward, I do want to just provide a little bit of caution to the board. Those who don't recall history are doomed to repeat it. And this picture over here on the right, that's actually Harris Hall. That was Harris Hall in November 2010. I know Commissioner Sorensen was in that room. The elect Commissioner Bozovich was in that room as a spectator. That was when the county considered amending our floodplain regulations the last time. These can be very controversial. If this is a direction the board wants to move in, I would suggest that this problem be clearly articulated to the community, that it's understood why we're taking these steps, that we provide credible studies and information to the public so they can understand the linkages between the proposed regulations and the risks and how those regulations would mitigate those risks, and that we spend the proper amount of time to build not consensus, because you'll never get consensus from the entire community on something this controversial, but instead what we call informed consent, and that's that the community understands our dilemma, they understand the problem behind it, and even though they don't agree with it, they begrudgingly say, okay, we understand there's a real risk here. The county has a responsibility to provide for the public's health and safety. We can get behind this even though we're not, we don't have 100% consent. That's about the best we can look for in a situation like this. And then finally, I just recommend that we take adequate steps and we don't overreach because, again, the county has proposed wildfire safety standards in the past. We've proposed floodplain regulations in the past, and neither have been successful. So just a little bit of a word of caution moving forward. And with that, we're available for questions.
Okay, very good. We set this up for a work session, and so I want to be mindful of our time. We set it up for 30 minutes, so I think we've taken about 25 minutes. Is that your estimate? About right? So
20, maybe 20.
okay. I think the first item probably took 5 minutes, so what would you say? Okay. So the board can take the remaining 30 minute, or the remaining time, 30 minutes to discuss this, or we can extend the time. I just want to be mindful that we suggested it be a 30-minute item. So do commissioners want to be recognized so we can have a work session on this? Commissioner Buck?
I appreciate the information and the background since I was not here in 2010. It sounds like these items may be just as controversial today as they were back then. However, since then, we've had some significant wildfires, and perceptions have changed a little bit. So I want to talk about what we could do, but know that there's, offsets to each item we could or could not regulate. And get, I would like to get some historical feedback from the commissioners who were here at that time, and some ideas on what would be really needed for the health and safety of our community, and also know that we want to preserve some property rights for folks out there. So I just want to take a few minutes just to say that to get us started.
Okay. Any other commissioners would like to be recognized on this? Commissioner Bozievich, go ahead.
Real quick, that picture was taken not at a hearing about floodplain regulation or floodway regulation. It was taken at a hearing about streamside setbacks, where there was a setback of 200 feet proposed with no science behind it that was basically looking to do it for habitat and water quality, not floodplain protection. So, and that,
If I could clarify, there were two ordinances before the board that day. One of them dealt with streamside setbacks, the other dealt with.
that's what filled the room, was the streamside setbacks.
I-
So
I'll just mention, I received a lot of comments
Yeah.
during that process about the floodplain regulations as well, so.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I know, I was in the audience, and I know why most of the people were there, and it was about the streamside setbacks. The fire issues, we do have that Measure 49 issue we've got to deal with. One of the places, though, I think we may be able to work around that, and what I would maybe suggest the staff look into developing further, is we really need to think about our driveway and access standards. One of the things I dealt with quite a bit in doing land development work in a lot of jurisdictions was you had to have the ability to get a piece of fire equipment with a turnaround within 150 feet of the structure. And that's something I'm not, seeing on some of those examples. I don't see, one, a 20-foot wide, suitable roadway, that can take a fire vehicle. Two, whether it reaches up to within 150 feet, because one of the things that may keep people from building so far back is if they've got to build that level of driveway with bridges that can hold that equipment at 20 foot of width, with the turnaround for that kind of equipment, which is a significant, especially if you're on a slope, requires a significant amount of area to do so. That may be where we get at this, where it won't necessarily put us into a Measure 49 situation if we're strictly looking at that fire safety access. So looking at with turnarounds, distance from the structure, and maybe also we need to take a look at, and this is just in not only our subdivision and our land policy, is there a maximum number of units allowable on a dead end where we require streets to be made through streets? And something we might want to work into our code in the future. I mean, this gets to Collard Lake Road. It gets to, our issues out in, Commissioner Buck's neighborhood, but that's where I'd like to try and see maybe a little bit more focus on what can we do, because I know what the fire departments want to see. They want to be able to get within 150 feet of that structure with a roadway that will support their equipment, that has a turnaround so they can get out if they have to. You know, they need to be able to evacuate too, not only the people there. So that's a place I think we can go. On the floodplain regulations, we are in excess of what, you know, flood insurance requires. I used to do that modeling for a living. In fact, there was, you know, a house off of, up there off of Sunderman right before the 96 floods that we had just finished being built off of modeling that our firm did, that, you know, had to have that flood, that finished floor 2 feet above the flood elevation. Well, it turned out to be the 500-year flood for that stream, you know, that 96 flood for the Mohawk. And that actually, even though we were estimating 2 feet above the 100-year, it actually stayed 2 feet above the 500-year. Because you do those studies with enough safety factors that, you know, going higher in that elevation, you're going higher than something that's already got a lot of built-in things, whether it's what you're assuming for the Manning's coefficients for the floodway and all that. There's all sorts of places where engineers just build a little bit of safety in. I would be interested in seeing about the cut and fill regulation, because there is a flood storage issue that goes with floodplain that has a component preventing downstream flooding. And if you fill that storage, you're moving that flood volume down the river. So whether or not we have a balanced cut and fill, most of the other jurisdictions I've worked in as an engineer, you had to balance cut and fill in floodplain. But with the picture that there is biological opinion out of NIMS on FEMA's floodplain program, that's basically going to completely change our regulation of floodplain anyway. So you might want to speak to that for a minute. Maybe the rest of the board might not be familiar.
Sure. I anticipated that question might come up today, and I did just have a call with the state's floodplain specialist up at the Department of Land Conservation and Development to get the latest on what the status is of the biological opinion. Apparently, no surprise, it has been delayed just in the last couple of months, another 3 years. So the federal government wants to study floodplain regulations nationwide, not just the specific kind of look at the Northwest because of the endangered salmonid. So it's going to be a programmatic national approach. We probably won't have any requirements for at least 3 years. That's the takeaway I got.
That's good to know. Then I would support looking into the balanced cut and fill issue.
Good. Let me take a crack at this, and then I'll call on Commissioner Burney. Well, first of all, on the issue of having a surgical surgical strike as opposed to having an overlay zone, it seems like the ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry standards of 1991 seem to be out of date, and that the fire risk because of climate change is actually increasing. When I think about this job and step back from all of the many zillions of things we have to do, I think, well, safety is one of the most important parts of our job, to make sure that the appropriate public role in safety standards is met. And I don't think that the 1991 standards that in our code only apply to park and forest lands. They don't apply to agricultural lands. They don't apply to residential property. They don't apply. So having the overlay, which applies to all land, appeals more to me in terms of, and also increasing the timeliness of the science that's used. So the California wildfire experiences are, as Commissioner Buck alluded to, that's along with our own experiences, is really a reason why the public is looking for, I think, fair and scientifically based reasons for having these rules. Similarly, we've heard a lot of testimony over the years and a lot of public comment over the years about this business of turnaround for our fire apparatus. This is getting not only fires, but also emergency vehicles, like EMT vehicles coming to people's houses out there. If we're implying by approving, by not having a rule about fire apparatus and how big it's gotten and how heavy it's gotten and what the turnaround is needed, it seems to me we're way behind public expectations for public safety. And we can't let people build out there without them understanding, or I guess we should just basically say, no, you can't do that because we don't have any way to save you if there is a major conflagration. So I think we ought to really be upping the game on the type of science, the most current science, and as applicable as possible to the various climates and subclimates and microclimates in Lane County that these regulations, I believe, are appropriate for. Now, I wonder if we can, in the same concept of an overlay, if there's such a thing as an overlay in the flood arena. Is there such a thing?
There is, that's what we currently have in place, is a floodplain regulation overlay zone that has those standards that I just
So
discussed.
the overlay zone that we're using in the flood arena, we're not using in the fire arena.
The fire safety standards are based on zoning districts.
Yeah.
It's not a floating zone that applies to various districts.
Well, I would say, with the seriousness of flooding and the concern that I have that we are seeing, and this is hard to imagine, but we're seeing more and more 500-year floods. We're seeing floods in the 500 range, where before we saw floods in the 100-year range. Well, that's all consistent with what I'm understanding to be the current climate science, which is that these flood events are getting more and more and more severe. So what I'm saying is we need to have a proposal that is based upon the expected future floods, not some Army Corps of Engineers map that's 25 years old, but the science that our board needs to rely upon so that we are giving people a proposal if we keep moving on this, which I hope we will, that the board is giving some information to the public through this process. And last but not least, I want to ask you about flood insurance. Now, you mentioned that one of the things that you wanted to emphasize was that regulation, the way the Board of Commissioners, the Planning Commission, you guys, the entire county, that's only one tool. And I totally agree with that. But isn't there a way for us to achieve a lower premium for flood insurance by having, let's say, better, not higher or lower, but better standards for flood risk? And that would lower the cost and would be an incentive for the public to say, oh, well, I see these commissioners are trying to lower our flood insurance costs because they've provided for appropriate levels, like not building in floodways, like not putting critical infrastructure close to rivers and streams, things that are well within our authority, and I just think it's something we ought to be doing. But I'd like to hear your view on the flood insurance, especially.
So that's correct. Counties who participate in what's known as the community rating system, which is a sort of a sub-program of the...
Are we doing that?
We are, yeah. We've been participating in the program since 2009. There's a number of different steps that you can take that can, a score that you can get basically depending on how much effort you're putting into it. You can lower your risk between 5 and 50%. Lane County is a Community 7, Category 7 community, so we get a 15% discount. So all policyholders countywide receive a 15% discount currently on their flood insurance premiums based on the activities we already take. I mean, a lot of that is because the county really does have a solid floodplain management program.
Can we get more than 15%?
We can.
How do we do that?
Well, there's a number of different activities that you can do. Probably the biggest reason, just so you understand why we are to get the discount, it's partially to do with some of the standards which are higher. It's also because we have so much undevelopable land in the county. It's also because we have a number of certified floodplain managers on staff. We do an annual outreach about flooding risks. There's a number of things. Additional, where the points really are, a lot of points come from updates to the regulation, so you can score points for things like you mentioned, prohibiting development in the floodway, but also other things that a county can take, like managing our stormwater system that are sort of outside the purview of land use, providing advanced warning in the event of a flooding event, things that would be in the emergency management purview, buying out repetitive loss properties that get flooded again and again. They have, they keep getting insurance payouts. So the county could try to identify grant funding to go and elevate or purchase and buy out those properties. So there's a number of different activities we could take to try to increase that score.
Okay. Commissioner Boziewicz, or Bernie?
I'm just kidding. You better not know. First, thank you. Sure. I learned a lot through the presentation, and it's clear that you grapple with this more than I do. It also seems that, I don't know if you can easily, but you had that map up of presidential disaster declarations. I would really request you update that the next time, the next time we're looking, because it may be my gut, and my gut may be incorrect, but I would love to see that updated and then matched against the one you have now to see if, in fact, this is increasing, because it seems like every other week on the news, I'm watching some other climate event, such as the flooding going on in the Midwest right now. So that would be really helpful to me. And also, I would vote that we continue moving on with this. And I would request, and I hope this is okay, but I would request that you give us a more digested sense of what you think, given a cost benefit, are the things that maybe hone it in a little bit in terms of options that we have, because I would love to see a mix of regulated but not onerous and those other kinds of incentives that work to support each other and somehow we can afford. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well stated on that last, Commissioner Bernie. Alternatives that aren't necessarily onerous, a more robust warning system, for instance. I heard you state that, Chair. And, I just wanted to say one thing. You're presenting us with the data that is accurate, that is historically correct, other than the outdated presidential emergency chart. What I would like to lay over that is that quite often we, or any political body, which I wish we were not, has a political reason for looking at tighter regulations, and the reason may be, or looking at looser regulations, and it may be more than just a stated safety issue. It may be something quite different. So I hope and expect that we'll be able to focus this on safety and on life-saving and ways to protect people in flood events and in wildfire events, and not simply another, what you called here, and you said this, I'm not suggesting that you said it with any particular thought in mind, one more layer of regulations that can be applied, which layers of regulations tend to slow down housing, for instance housing development, and tend to slow down any building. So we're not looking at this simply as one more layer of regulations that can be applied, but really something that is actually focusing on the original intent of this work session, which was personal safety and family safety in the event of a flood or a fire. And I'll point out, one thing that I'll point out quite often, I think from now on, is that in our health in all policies discussion, we have a health in all policy policy, I guess, in Lane County. This is always a part of it. That's right on the checklist that you get, is how does it affect the health in the county? Housing is always going to be one of the questions that you need to answer. So as we look forward with any recommendations, making certain that housing, the question of how does this affect housing in terms of physical neighborhood attributes, housing affordability, residential stability, social community housing safety quality, making certain that we do always bear in mind that this is a requirement of any discussion we have regarding policy. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner?
Thank you, Chair. After being able to hear everybody's diverse opinions, it brings back to mind some of the issues why this was brought up in the first place, and these were the most controversial issues that I saw in the Chapter 16 review. And I know that we don't have, hours and hours today to talk about it, but I appreciate having you get us started. This is specific to, absolutely being able to save lives. And, I'm a housing advocate. Of course, I want to build homes for people to live in, but I just don't want them to all burn up right after you build them. So there's clearly a balancing effect that we need to make. And I would second coming back with ideas in which we can improve the code to a point where it is safety first, yet also know that we want to keep property rights for those people who have earned their land and tend to it every day. I live on a road that's fairly rural in unincorporated Lane County, and I have personally seen emergency vehicles try to get to a home, but it is up on a windy hill, and the EMT is stuck at the bottom of the hill, and then they have to carry everything up to that house and carry that person back out. It's just not safe. And it is actually extra unsafe for those first responders. So there's got to be some ways in which we can incorporate some updates given the knowledge that we've gained over the past decade, and improve what we've got and keep this conversation going.
Okay, do you have what you need now at the end of our first round of this work session?
I do. I'm hearing pretty clear indication that the board's interested in having us come back to try to provide some options, some reasonable options, balanced options, and be a little more specific with our recommendations on which we think, which sort of potential changes we would recommend. I would ask or suggest that the board maybe bifurcate this process and have us come back with a work session specifically on floodplain regulations and one on wildfire. I think they're distinct enough and there's enough material in each one that probably 2 work sessions would be appropriate.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so we'll plan on doing that then.
Okay, yes. Oh, Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. I'll try and be as quick as I can. 3 quick things. Driveway standards would be universal for all zones if we adopt those. So it would bring in ag and RR. Overlay zones become extremely problematic. I've been dealing with them on the coast with the beaches and dunes overlay and all that, where people were having problems just getting a septic system repaired because of the overlay zone. So I'm not really hep on an overlay zone. I think the driveway access standards would be a better way to go. We also have somebody that would help us inspect and enforce in our fire districts. Finally, I just want, I made copies of this because the wildfire prevention plan came up, and I made copies for each commissioner, but this is the over 100-year trend of fires. There's one for each commissioner, and I got an extra for Diana if she needs. That's yours. There is not a significant trend upward in wildfires, and to say so because of a 20-year chart is presenting bad data. Whether you look at the number of acres burned or number of fires, you can't say that over the last century. So let's not cloud this with that issue. Let's just talk about what's right for safety. And there are safety issues with wildfire. And I agree that there are safety issues with wildfire, but let's not try and pretend it's because of climate change or some significant change in fire behavior in Oregon. It's not. So let's try and keep that out of this and just talk purely about trying to keep the public safe. I'm all about trying to keep the public safe.
Okay, go ahead.
If I might just respond to that briefly, I know that that was a statistic that was provided by the Oregon Department of Forestry at the presentation last week that Commissioner Bozovich brought up then. I did speak with the Department of Forestry afterwards, and they just wanted me to articulate, if I had opportunity, that the reason we've seen a drop-off in wildfire acres burned and the number of wildfires from the early 1900s is because our suppression efforts have gotten so effective. So there were a lot of big wildfires earlier in the century, last century, and we were very effective at fighting those, at stopping them before they spread. So the trend shows a high number of wildfires 100-plus years ago. Then it goes down dramatically through the 70s, 80s, and then it starts to pick up again. And the reason I'm told that is because we've been so effective at putting out wildfires for the last 100 years that the fuel load within the forests has built up, because that was the natural sort of cleansing cycle of the forest. So the fuel loads have built up to such a high level that now those same suppression efforts, even with all our new technology, same suppression efforts that have been working for 100 years, no longer are able to keep up. So there's kind of there is a concern from the fire safety specialists that, we are effective at putting out wildfires, and we had a long period there in the 19th century where we were effective at that, but now the fuel loads are really building up. So that's the concern I hear from the first responders.
I thought it was just since Joe and I have been alive that there has been a big drop in forest fires, but could be wrong on that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think what we ought to do is bifurcate this, shoot for agenda team, and you can keep us informed as to what seems reasonable under the circumstances. Thank you very much. Okay, and thanks to everybody for hanging in there with us on our lengthy agenda. Okay, so I think I'll ask Mr. Mokrahysky, and I will go back to adjustments to the agenda, way up there on item 2 on page 2. What else do we have to do?
10B. Mr. Chair, if you want to take that up, Christine Moody is here for the financial report. I have a couple of announcements, which Mr. Dingell.
We'll ask Ms. Moody to come forward, and we'll ask Mr. Mokrahysky to move ahead on 10A, and as soon as you're done with 10A, we'll go into 10B.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just a quick setup on this. We do, as with our strategic plan, where we do quarterly updates on the strategic plan to make sure that we're keeping that a living document that is regularly revisited, that the board is engaged in what's happening there. We also have had the practice of doing quarterly financial reports, which provide the board some information about national, state, and local economic indicators. So you sort of get a little bit of a touch base on what the economy is looking like, more from a trending perspective, looking back over the last quarter. Often we have had Brian Rooney, our regional economist from the state of Oregon, come and present on those portions. And then we provide a little bit of information about the last quarter financial report on the general fund and the road fund, or if there's another fund that the board has been interested in or has been financially distressed. So that's what this is. We don't ask for action, but again, it's intended to be sort of a quick touch base in making sure that the budget process is not just a 2-week process that you have with the budget committee in early to mid-May, but it is really something that we are always reviewing and making part of the work that we do. So that's why we're here, and I'll turn it over to Christine to provide an update on our financial status.
So we're moving now from 10A, our announcements.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I had said 10B. If you.
Okay, well, let's go for 10B right now, because I think Ms. Moody is ready to go, and that is are in the matter of the presenting of the second quarter FY 18-19 financial report. So welcome again, Ms. Moody, who started the day with us.
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you, Chair Sorensen, Commissioners. So I will just walk through the report and do some highlights for you. I won't read everything. Hopefully you've all reviewed it a little bit, but as Mr. Mokrzycki mentioned, just to give an overview, comparing back to the second quarter of last fiscal year, both with some economic data and then also some monitoring of the budget and the spending of the budget and both the funds that were mentioned, the general fund and the road fund. So we start out with just some very high-level national economic indicators. The CPI year-over-year change was 1.9 nationally. We also look at a new indicator referred to as the West B and C, which is cities below 2.5 million, because they eliminated the Portland-Salem index. That's the one we used to look at. So that is why you see that B and C there, and it year-over-year change was 0.6. So national unemployment still remains very low, dropped to 3.9 in December. That was down from 4.1 the same period. And then inflation over just counting 12 months, so not exactly December to December, but starting with January through December, you'll see is 2.1. Now, you will notice that both November and December are completely flat on inflation. So, and in fact, some of the indicators you look at, there were dips in December, actually. Just a brief summary of the report too. I mentioned unemployment levels. The local unemployment levels also remain very low. We have some charts just on those. And then there's some summary there about the general fund, but I'll wait and touch on the details as we get to those rather than the summary. So page 3 of the report, if you are following along, we talk more about the local economic indicators. As was mentioned, Brian Rooney, our regional economist, does sometimes present. You'll remember he was here for our leadership team in January to start off the budget process. So he does come to some of these meetings. When he doesn't, a lot of this data is coming from him. You'll see him quoted in several places. So we go out to the state websites to get this information. But unemployment in Lane County rose very slightly over the last 6 months, but we are now in the 27th month in a row of unemployment being under 5%. And then in Oregon, it was 4% in June 2018, rose very slightly to 4.3 in December. There is a job growth outlook, and I think you've seen this chart probably in the last quarterly report, or Brian Rooney touched on it when he was here, just a 10-year outlook of job growth in Lane County. It is very positive. They are starting to indicate that there'll be some growth in the higher wage job sectors, which will be great. So we should continue to see some strong local growth in wages, or in job growth, sorry. Labor force participation, this is definitely a graph you've seen before. I couldn't find one that was more up to date. It is a bit of a forecast out. But just talking about the participation of people in the workforce, we saw a decrease after the Great Recession. It has started to come up a little bit in the last few years. And then on the next piece is we look at the U6 unemployment rate, which does try to get to additional data in the unemployment rate rather than just looking at the regular one that we report on. This one will include anyone who's looked for work in the last 12 months, anyone who's working part-time that really would prefer to work full-time but cannot find that work, or anyone who has looked in the last 4 weeks and are not working. So on that one, we are at about 8.3% was the average for 2018. I did use the language, I realize now I used kind of the wrong word. I said exceeded pre-recession. What I meant was better, but really the rate is lower, right? So I realized after I reread it this morning, that's not the word I wanted to use. So the rate is lower than it was pre-recession. Then I did find some reports out there, this next piece about per capita income in 2017 is a Brian Rooney report that was out there fairly recently. The U.S. Department of Commerce released the data in November 2018 for 2017, and it's specific to Lane County. So per capita income for Lane County did grow slightly in 2017, 2.8%. Total personal income was an increase of 2.7%, but if we look at 2016, it had grown 4.5% in that year. So growth, but slower than we saw in 2016. And then they do give some statistics to compare us statewide. So we're 10th among Oregon counties for personal income. We're only about 90% of statewide and 84% of the US numbers there. Then from, on the housing side, real estate statistics, this won't surprise you that 2018 saw increases both in the median and the average sales prices. The average is now $309,000, and the median sale rose 8.7% up to $282,000. I did include here some U.S. Census report that I found that was really new from Brian Rooney that talks about building permits. We typically also will provide you with our Lane County building permits data. I just received that this morning. So I do have a handout that I could share with you if you'd like to see that. You want to hand it to me? Let me keep one. So it gives more specific for us. Of course, this U.S. Census is going to have cities and others where we're just talking about land management. But we do provide you here with the quarterly by property type, both commercial and residential. And you can see that as you compare the full years. Well, I point out here, of course, that the fourth quarter of a calendar year is the second quarter of the fiscal year. So that's what we're talking about, is that fourth quarter that's the second for the fiscal year. So I did put some dotted lines there around that quarter, just so you could see the two combined. So the quarter was down a little bit for the same time period last year, but if you look at the full calendar years, then 17-18 was higher. So there's some more specific for ours. Then just to go into the budget monitoring that I mentioned. So we do have, on page 7, we give you a comparison for the quarters of all county funds all rolled up together. So this gives you our beginning fund balance, budgeted versus year-to-date actuals, some specific revenue sources, transfers in, and other resources. To get to our current budget is the second column from the right. So you can see that 718.5 million was current budget as the time that this was prepared. And then requirements, expenditures, we will break those out for you by salaries and wages, employee benefits, material and services, capital. You will notice we have an asterisk down at the bottom that if you look at the total revenue versus the total expenditures, revenue is lower than expenditures. That's because this expenditure number includes a lot of one-time expenses. You see capital is in there. And then we do have times where these transfers, even though in accounting you wouldn't count them as revenue, we do on the budget side say if those are ongoing transfers happening every year because they're supporting a service, that it really is an ongoing revenue for the fund. So just want to explain that imbalance there. We'll talk a lot more about revenue and expenditures as we go through the budget process and what means, how do we define a structurally balanced budget. So then specific to the funds, starting with the general fund, we do collect a large amount of our revenue with our property taxes, of course. That's now the largest revenue source in the general fund. So we've received over 70% of our budgeted revenue, even though we were at the 50% mark through the year. And I did point out a little bit that we have had a delay in our Secure Rural Schools payment. This is the latest that we've received it for the general fund. We typically would receive that in November. They're saying with the government shutdown, that slowed everything down, so we're hoping to see it. We haven't even received it to date, so we typically receive it in the second quarter. We have had a couple things that you've heard of, the Comcast payment for the property tax decision that happened, and then state marijuana revenue. A few other revenues have come in high enough that you don't see a huge shift year over year when you're looking at second quarter. You don't see the missing Secure Rural Schools payment at a glance. It kind of offset it, but just so you know what's behind those numbers. On the expense side, we're flat compared to last year. So we were right at 44.93% of our budgeted expenses last year, and now we're 44.92. So there is a total budget difference, of course, both on the revenue side and the expense side. If you look at total annual budget in that chart, I do mention that a piece of that is spending some one-time Secure Rural Schools money, such as the Housing Improvement Program that was launched. And so that's why you're seeing a budget difference the year over year, even though percentage of budget spent is the same. And then on the road fund, they provide some detail here. This comes from Public Works. So they are seeing rising gas tax revenue in the road fund because of House Bill 2017. So that's good. They have had a few revenues that they detail for you in the report here that have come in slower. So that's offsetting. You're not seeing quite as large of a percentage decrease of what they've collected, but they did want to highlight that for you. They typically don't receive their Secure Rural Schools payment until January, so it wouldn't have appeared in this quarter anyway, but they also have not received it, so hopefully we'll get it in March. One thing just to note is that the road fund actually is paid interest when we don't receive our payments on time, whereas in the general fund, we do not receive any interest when BLM pays us slowly. And then the road fund on the expense side, they've spent about 36.8% of their budget. Of course, they're ramping up for their busier season with spring and the better weather in June. So that is right on target. It's just a little bit below last year, but they do detail for you also quite a few of their increase in budget occurring because of that additional revenue coming in from the state, where they have invested that in capital projects, paving. And so you see quite a difference in their year-over-year budget, 17-18 to 18-19. So with that, I'm available for questions.
Okay, do any commissioners have questions? Commissioner Farr?
Thank you. This is a good report, one that we're accustomed to seeing. Thank you, Christine. And in looking at the numbers, you know, I want to talk about something that's just slightly attached to this report, and that is a little bit beyond the performance of Lane County, but really what something Commissioner Sorensen talked about earlier in today's meeting, meaningful life. And really, one thing that we have to consider at all times is what is the actual living condition that the Lane County families are experiencing. And if we look at two numbers on here, one is the average median income, and the second is the average median home sale price. So we look at what's happened since 2007 to date. There's been a little bit of up and down, but from 2007 to date, the average median income has gone up about 10%-ish in those years. The average median home sale price has gone up about 50% since then. Big imbalance there. And what that does is it creates that same imbalance in the ability for families to meet their daily needs, their other daily needs. So at some point, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what does it cost to live in Lane County? What does it cost a family to live in Lane County? People who are living at or near the poverty line, you know, where the average median income is, personal income is at, is showing something around $43,000, not much above the poverty line, really. So what does it cost a family to live? What is the cost of childcare, for instance? What is the cost of housing and rents, for instance? And how does that apply to the people who are actually watching us smile about the wonderful performance of Lane County and how we're meeting our budgets and not exceeding revenues, while at the same time they're borrowing money to put food on the table? You know, so yeah, I'd just like to kind of position that against the types of discussion that we have regarding the financial report, the financial report, because just talking about how government is doing doesn't really reflect well on the, once again, meaningful life philosophy that you know, really we are responsible for at some level. And can we affect that? In what ways can we affect the way people are able to live comfortably in the county that we are responsible for creating policies for? It's a broader discussion than we can have just simply today, and it really sounds a little bit like a continuation of something that I always say regarding poverty and how it relates to housing and how housing relates to poverty and how all of that relates to the, let's see, meaningful life that families experience. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I don't see anyone else that wants to ask questions about this, unless there are. Yes, Commissioner Burney.
I just want to say here to Commissioner Farr's remarks. I think it almost, is this budget structure continue to be structurally balanced?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Both of these, yes.
So I think what I'm hearing, which would be really cool at some point, although I'm not prepared, is to talk about the relationship of a structural balance of a county's budget and the structural imbalance of many people's lives in the county. When I was listening and looking, it reminded me of years ago when I got an economics degree, and they talked about something called a Phillips curve. And as I recall, it was that an ideal sort of trade-off is about 4% inflation with 4% unemployment or something like that. So now back then, well, are we now off the Phillips curve, Christine?
That I can answer for you. I also studied economics, but I'm
That's
not an
what I'm asking
economist.
Okay.
Not remembering that class.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not remembering that.
That's all. Thank you very much. I was just trying to decipher if we were still structurally balanced, and it sounds
Yes.
like we are.
Yes. And on the Phillips curve, we're under 4% inflation and we're under 4% GDP.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so,
would think we're a little off it, because that was optimal back then.
right. But we may be close, I think we're probably around 2.5% inflation and 2.5% GDP. So I don't know if that's what the Phillips curve is. We'll need to look into that a little bit more.
Oh,
but
don't worry about it. And my last question, as I understand, and this is new to me, so commercial prices have gone down? Commercial real estate?
Permits,
Permits. Thank you
permits,
very
that's
much.
all land
I
management,
apologize.
yes, not prices.
I'm done. Thank you.
That I don't
Okay,
have data on.
thank you very much. I think that concludes that report. Thank you so much for your thorough report. Okay, I'm going over the big list here. So I did everything on page 1, unless there's any emergency business. Page 2, we did everything, I believe. Page 3, we've done everything except for commissioners' announcements, agenda team requests, work session requests, and executive session and other business. So that's what I'm kind of focused on right now, right?
Yes, I have some announcements too.
Okay,
Sorry,
so
Mr.
let's
Chair.
go
I
to
jumped-
10A.
I took you out of order. Ms. Moody was down here, and I just wanted to use her time effectively. If it's all right, I can do some announcements, and I just have a few here. First, just to let the board know that the explanatory statement, as you recall, the board directed us to publish a voter's pamphlet. Required in the voter's pamphlet is an impartial, objective, explanatory statement of the measure that requires at least three individuals, one who is identified as for the measure, one who's identified as opposed to the measure, and one who's neutral. Mr. Rickoff did a great job of working with the League of Women Voters and identifying those three individuals. They met, I believe, yesterday, reviewed the explanatory statement, made some changes and back and forth. That was finalized and submitted to the clerk's office. And that is also a requirement to get the measure on the ballot. So because we're doing a voter's pamphlet, we have to have an explanatory statement in order for the measure to actually be placed on the ballot. That was all done. As of today, I believe the due date is Thursday. And so the measure will be on the ballot and the explanatory statement is done. The second thing I want to update the board on is Commissioners Buck and Farr know we have, I believe, 6 meetings scheduled for the shelter feasibility study implementation. We're still in search of a catchy name, so if you have any ideas, let us know. The TAC report steering committee that includes 2 commissioners, 2 members of the city council, 2 members of the Poverty and Homelessness Board, and the Eugene City Manager and Lane County Administrator. Commissioners Buck and Farr are the county commission representatives. Mayor Venus and Councilor Siret are the city council representatives. Pat Walsh and Chris McAllister are the Poverty and Homelessness Board. We were not successful in getting a Springfield representative to serve on the steering committee. They declined that participation. So we have all those individuals, and we have 6 meetings scheduled through April and up until May 6th. So we'll report more on all of that, but I just wanted to I know folks have been anxious about those meetings happening. Third, I wanted to let the board know that we received a letter from the Lane County Farmers Market, a joint letter from the Farmers Market and Saturday Market expressing appreciation to the City of Eugene and Lane County for work that we've done over the last several years to address concerns that both the Farmers Market and Saturday Market have had around activities that have inhibited health and safety during Saturdays in the spring, summer, and fall for their events. They also requested that we work with them on a number of items for this upcoming season, maintaining the regulations in place for the Free Speech Plaza, that people still have the ability to gather and express their free speech, their constitutional free speech rights. But one of the challenges that we've seen in the Free Speech Plaza is that it's gone beyond speech, and we actually have individuals who are engaging in commercial activity within the Free Speech Plaza. And because, whereas in the city park blocks, they have regulations and all the folks have to apply to be vendors and they pay a fee and they have certain restrictions around not being able to use canopies unless they're tied down. All of these things that you would expect for an event that welcomes the public in at that scale. In the Free Speech Plaza, we have not had that, those types of abilities, and so there's a lot of challenges that have happened there. So we're working in partnership with the City of Eugene and the Eugene Police Department, as well as Lane County Farmers Market and the Saturday Market, to do what we can do to help support a healthy and safe environment on Saturdays for those events, for the public to experience, while also maintaining the free speech designation for that property. So I just wanted to share that with the board, and we'll be working on some things with those folks, and happy to answer any questions on that. And then finally, I just wanted to share, you might see this, this shiny little award that we received. Lane County last week at the United Way Community Celebration event that they have each year recognizes both an outstanding community partner as well as an outstanding community voice. Chris McAllister was recognized and awarded with the Community Voice Award, very appropriately. And Lane County was awarded the Community Partner Award for all the ways in which we engage throughout our various departments in partnering with organizations in the community that are trying to improve lives, families' lives, in the case of United Way Children's and Families' Lives. So I'll pass this around to the board, but I just wanted to make note of this and thank the board for your great continued efforts to support our engagement in different ways. We oftentimes talk about how Lane County doesn't have enough resources to provide the level of services in all areas that we'd like to, but we do a phenomenal job of hiring great talent and engaging and partnering with community organizations to solve challenges. So this was a great treat, and I think very appropriate to the work that we do in our organization. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let's move on to commissioners' announcements. Do any commissioners have any announcements they wish to make? Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. So real quick, I want to just jump back to this graph and just note that what staff relayed from ODF about fire behavior was also not climate related. It was about fuels relation. There's also some other issues involved in that, which is changes in U.S. Forest Service's directives on firefighting and their lack of attack on lightning-caused fire, and then also changes in federal forest management over the last 30 years that might account for any increase in acreage in the last 20 years. So I just want to make sure I'm clear about that, but I also have a couple other things I want to hand out that are related to a couple other past board items. Last week we had some discussion about aerial spray. I want to make sure the board was all aware of editorial that I wrote last year about what the water quality looks like off of forested watersheds as opposed to maybe suburban and a few others, and what that data is. I have all the backup data for that in a 3-ring binder that's about yay thick if any of you want to look through it. and the data's there that kind of shows that this concern about herbicide runoff coming from active forest management is really not a concern when it comes down to actual water quality testing from stream runoff from those watersheds. And that's the data I have. Finally, we had some testimony this morning looking for us to do local rent control. And I'd just like to pass out, here's one for you, a copy of an article that is basically a synopsis of multiple economists, not getting that out. Economists' opinions on how bad rent control is as a strategy to control housing costs. And my favorite quote in there is from a Swedish economist, God, it's getting late, economist.
I'm here for you, Jay.
Yeah, who is also a socialist, by the way, who basically said, paraphrasing him, is there's no better way to destroy a city other than rent control. The only thing that's better is bombing it. So that's the way economists got it that time. Think about rent control, and I just wanted folks to have maybe some background information on that before we jump to a knee-jerk reaction to public testimony.
Okay, I just want to announce that the Phillips curve is a single equation econometric model named after William Phillips, describing a historical inverse relationship between the rates of unemployment and corresponding rates of rises in wages that result with an economy. Thank goodness the next sentence starts with, simply stated, decreased unemployment, i.e. increased levels of employment in an economy, will correlate with higher rates of wage rises. Thank you, Commissioner Berney, for educating us further on the Phillips curve, which is also not to be confused with the Phillips relationship, which is a curve in supernova astrophysics. So, wow, our county engineer, well, we learn something new every day, don't we? So, do any other commissioners have any other announcements?
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Farr.
Commissioner Farr, then Commissioner Berney.
Mine is very short. We continue to march on Operation Welcome Home veterans, Oregon Operation Welcome Home. We're meeting on a regular basis, and a couple of things that we're doing. We're continuing to work on the Veterans by Name list. Lane County has an active and fairly accurate Veterans by Name list. All 36 counties in Oregon are encouraged to do the same that we're already doing. We've had a number of meetings so far, and it continues to move forward. It's a partnership here in Lane County with St. Vincent de Paul, Homes for Good, Lane County Veterans Services, and then a number of members of the Lane County staff. So, Mr. Mokryski, we're doing well on Welcome Home, and once again, your staff is shining as a beacon for other staffs to emulate the work that they do. Thank you.
I pass. I'm sorry.
Any other announcements?
No announcements.
We're good?
Agenda item.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to item 11B, agenda team requests, work session requests. Commissioner Buck.
We got a request from our ASME employees to bend our ear for 15 to 30 minutes regarding health in the workplace. And I, for one, would like to hear what they say, but I do need some head nods in order to add that to the agenda.
Yeah, Commissioner Bozievich.
Can I request that legal counsel review what they're proposing to present to us, maybe in HR, just to make sure we're not wandering into subjects of mandatory bargaining? Because workplace environment and some of those are mandatory subjects of bargaining. I appreciate they want to bring us some information they think would be helpful for us to know, and I want to hear from them, but I also do not want to accidentally set us up in a place where we might accidentally have an unfair labor practice or do something to violate PECPA here at the board. So that's my only concern with this, is to make sure we don't stray into areas of mandatory.
I don't think that's an unreasonable request, because virtually everything that the board, when they request an agenda item, the agenda team reviews it, and that includes the county administrator and legal counsel. And so items are screened by staff including HR, prior to being put on the agenda.
Which, that would mean that ASME would have to give their presentation to staff ahead of time.
Or at least they'd have to tell them what they were going to say. Okay, so does that sound reasonable? Okay,
Well, with a caveat, may be inclined to recuse during the meeting.
Yeah.
But I will examine that ahead of time. And I think that, as long as they do. Ms. Balker-Heisky, we're getting a request from one of our collective bargaining units. How many collective bargaining units do we work with?
We have 8. 3 of
8.
them are represented by AFSCME. The other 5 are represented by
Okay.
other units.
Excellent. Can we or shall we expect similar requests from the other bargaining units?
I have not seen any, but we may.
Okay, right.
from time to time, we do get requests from other bargaining units.
Because I would love to see the rank and file work, the nature of the work, and get reports on, this is how I operate my machinery, this is how, whatever it may be. So I'm excited about the prospect. Thank you.
Okay, any other, now, did we do the parks one last week?
Well, before we're off this,
Well, okay, before we're off one,
We did do the parks.
okay.
okay, I'm sorry.
Before we're off the AFSCME
Yeah.
request.
So from listening and reading the emails and stuff, I want to just make sure, I'm a head nod, I'd like to see that. It sounds like the process is such that the filter that Commissioner Bozovich required so that we don't enter into, any area we're not supposed to is in place. And so I just want to let you know, I'm good with that. I'd like you to proceed.
Yeah, very good. Okay, and Vice Chair, we did finish the park thing last week? So that's in progress, right?
Correct. The park gave that letter, which I handed over to
Parks
you.
Advisory asked for some time with the board, and is that still ongoing, or what's the status of that?
I think what I indicated is that I had met with one of the members of the Park Advisory Committee, and that as part of the proposed budget, we're considering some requests that that Public Works and the Parks Division have made related to additional funding for one-time and ongoing things connected to the master plan, and that we were going to work with the Park Advisory Committee to consider recommending to the board a task force, a revenue task force of some kind. That was my recollection.
Okay, and,
So we're working on it, and you should expect to see something in the county administrator's proposed budget.
okay, good. Are there any other agenda team requests or work session requests? I just wanted to check on one, and that was I guess you have the 2 from today, right? The
Wildfire study.
the wildfire and flood work sessions.
Yeah, I had 3. I didn't catch a specific review. Would you like me to review the assignments?
Yes, let's go there.
I had the Health and Human Services staff to return with a work plan on youth marijuana prevention this summer. Well, then I had a request from Commissioner Buck, which I'm not sure that was formally put in, to engage the Housing Policy Board in the, can't read my own writing, evaluation or formulation of proposals on affordable housing plan projects.
We're going to talk about that more tomorrow.
Tomorrow, so you want to hold on that?
Sure.
Okay, so we have one. And then the second one is the request from Commissioner Buck, as well as Commissioner Bozovich, for an AFSCME work session item to be reviewed by legal counsel before it's placed on the board to make sure it doesn't create any it's not related to any mandatory subjects of bargaining.
Okay. And then
Sorry,
the.
so then the
and then
wildfire,
we had the work sessions coming up on the topic of floodplain, floods and fires, but flood and fire separately.
those separate work sessions?
Separate, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, staff asked to have them separated.
Okay, any other review of assignments?
No.
Okay, and any commissioners catch any errors in that process? I didn't hear of any. Okay, so now we are ready to go for our executive session. But before we do that, I'll just mention that whatever we don't finish on the executive session for today will be carried over to tomorrow on our Wednesday, November 20 regular meeting, which has been noticed for executive session. So what I'm planning to do right now is to read the executive session for Tuesday, March 19, 2019.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Some of the items in the executive session may cause my recusal during the
Okay.
executive session, so I will, prior to your reading us into executive session, state that I have a conflict of interest in discussion regarding AFSCME. My son is a shop steward in AFSCME.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Sorensen?
Yeah.
Commissioner Farr, could you check with legal counsel? Because I believe some of what we're going to be talking about that relates to AFSCME is not relating to any sort of compensation, which would be your direct conflict.
Thank you, and we are checking on that as we
Thank you.
speak, Commissioner Bozievich.
Okay, so the language for the executive session is the Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations and to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. We're going to be doing that in the Board of Commissioners conference room upstairs when we recess here, and we'll be reconvening in executive session upstairs. This executive session is held pursuant to RS 192.660 2D and H, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decisions will be made in executive session. At this time, we do reserve the right to come back out into public session after the conclusion of our executive session, should the need arise. So at this time, we're in recess. We'll be reconvening upstairs in the Board of Commissioners conference room in executive session. Thank you.